the 2nd of December 2024 and my first entry in the TooFatLardies Christmas Advent calendar for this year. And as I open up the Advent window for the 2nd, the question behind the window is, if you could influence figure designs, what changes would you suggest that you think would improve the miniatures we have on the table? Over the course of over 40 years of buying, converting and painting Wargames figures, I hope this is a topic that at least I've got a little bit of experience to talk about. But I know so have many of you as well. It's been a journey. We've gone from metal figures to plastic, through fine cast, to resin cast, and we're really in a golden age of Wargame figure sculpting and manufacture. In a way, you might think after 40 years of people creating Wargames figures, everything must be perfect, right? I remember the first figures I bought right back in February 1981. They were non-dynamic, I think that's probably the word. They were pretty stiff. They had open hands. They had head swaps available and a variety of weapons. And I think the idea was that you had basic generic figures and you swapped the weapons and the heads to make them a bit more interesting. Looking at them now, they do look pretty much of their time. I've still got them. And we've certainly come a long way from that. Some of the things that figure sculptors produce, not only by hand but also by computer-assisted design, look truly incredible and amazing. But that's not really the question which is on the Advent window. The question is, what improvements could be made? It's not just to say how great the figures are that we've got. Well, I think if I was drawing up a list for Father Christmas, I might say, well, we need more figures which are in campaign dress. It'd be great to see a table of figures in campaign dress and to try and make them come alive, despite the fact that their uniforms are going to be worn or perhaps dirty or mud spattered. Or I might say, we need more urban civilians. We've got lots of rural civilians in many ranges, but specifically urban civilians for Wargames. We've got a few, but we could probably have more. And there's certainly a role just for unarmed figures on the table, which are great for scenario generation and for non-combatants who can still play an important role in many battles throughout history. And I'm always a bit of a sucker for head swaps, the ability, rather than cutting the head off a figure, to swap out different heads, especially because there's so many different head variants which are available online that people have 3D printed. But I wonder, once I've made this wish list, it just really seems to be a wish list that I'm sure everyone listening to this would be able to create. A wish list of what you'd probably want in the figures for your next range and period. So I want to go a little bit further than that, away from the generic, to look at really what the question's asking. What improvements for the figures as figures would I really make? And I think that's possibly a personal choice. It might be a little bit controversial as well, but bear with me for a moment. A few years ago, back at the Antwerp show, before the pandemic, I had a great conversation with one of the titans of the hobby. And he was saying to me that a particular range of very small 6mm figures were fantastic because on the Franco-Prussian German officers, you could even see the monocles. And truly he was correct. They were and are an incredible range of figures. And there's so many miniature figures that you probably have in your boxes or tables at the moment that you can point to, which are just pure jewels of the figure sculptor's art. And if anything, that's got more pronounced with 3D printing. The ability to sculpt something in 3D and then reduce it down to any figure size is an incredibly powerful tool. But at the same time, I've been aware for a couple of years now that there's a bit of a distinction between figures as photographed and figures on the Wargames table. There's a degree of detail on a lot of figures that is either difficult to paint, or when it's painted, it's not necessarily apparent on the table. Looks great in photographs, and they're a perfect example of a figure painter's art. Don't want to lose that. But if there's one thing which slightly drives me crazy, is that when detail is on a figure and it doesn't really add to the figure. Now, of course, there is an argument that with a historical War Games figure, the sculptor's really trying to recreate history, and I totally accept that. At the same time, sometimes all of that detail is difficult to paint, it's not particularly visible, and it almost detracts from the overall look of the figures on the table. It may not detract from the look of the figure in a photograph, but when it's on the War Games table, I'm really looking for something which is easy to paint, simple, and doesn't really get lost in the detail while still retaining the historical character of the combatant. Another thing which I'd really like to change and influence figure designers in is really making their figures robust. This is a particular personal thing of mine. I use my figures a lot for participation gaming. I think there's nothing nicer than sitting down with friends and then moving the figures around. And I obviously do that at games days and shows. You need robust figures to be able to do that. There's a particularly nice range of figures which I'll not call out by name, but they are beautifully sculpted. But the swords and the bayonets on those figures tend to be less than robust, and it's depressing and sad really to have a figure that you spent so long painting then to lose its sword and bayonet, and you have to go in to try and rectify that to enable the figure to be saved. It's particularly true of participation games which are skirmish games when single figures are being moved. So trying a way in which figures can have more robust swords, bayonets and spears would really be something which I would encourage, and if I could influence figure designers to ensure. And in a strange way, perhaps that goes back to where we started in our time warp, our TARDIS of Lard, if you like, again, back to the early 1980s, with what looked to be so stiff then, the open hands and the changeable heads and the versatility of figures which could actually have weapons added into their hands and glued in so they didn't come out. And I do think there's a lot to recommend that. It requires a certain amount of additional work. I do accept that, but if one's doing that with plastic figures, one could potentially do that with metal figures. And that situation would add the flexibility for steel spears to be added, and also perhaps swords and other weapons or rifles with bayonets to be cast from a different, stronger, or at least more robust metal. I wonder if that would ever catch on. Perhaps that's a future which we could have embraced at some point in the early 2000s, but we've never really quite got there. But for the figure manufacturers who still do offer the possibility of figures with open hands, here's me saying thank you for that. I really appreciate that little gift which has come to me not just at Christmas, but throughout this year and hopefully throughout all years.